The year was 1967. America was changing faster than anyone could imagine. New highways stretched across the country. Small towns were becoming busy cities. Families gathered around television sets every evening. Children raced their bicycles through quiet neighborhoods until the streetlights came on. Every day felt ordinary. Every moment seemed forgettable. Yet on one cool spring morning, inside the United States Mint, something happened that nobody would remember. Thousands upon thousands of blank metal discs moved down enormous production lines. The sound of giant coining presses echoed through every corner of the building. Workers checked machines. Conveyor belts never stopped moving. Everything happened with perfect timing. One blank planchet entered the press. A fraction of a second later, George Washington's portrait appeared. The eagle was struck on the reverse. The word Liberty surrounded the top. The date, 1967, another Washington quarter had just been born. To the workers, it was only one coin among millions. Nobody stopped to admire it. Nobody photographed it. Nobody placed it into a special box. It simply joined thousands of other quarters before disappearing into a heavy canvas bag. That bag was loaded onto an armored truck before sunrise. The truck left the mint without anyone giving a second thought to the coins inside. Hours later, the shipment reached a Federal Reserve facility, then local banks, then grocery stores, then gas stations, then restaurants. The little quarter had officially entered the world. Its first owner was a young cashier working in a neighborhood supermarket. She received it as part of her change while buying lunch during her break. Without looking at the date, she dropped it into the pocket of her apron. That evening, she used the same quarter to buy a newspaper from a street vendor. The vendor placed it inside an old cash register already filled with hundreds of other coins. The next morning, a delivery driver received it while buying coffee. Later that afternoon, a mechanic carried it inside his toolbox for nearly a week before spending it at a roadside diner. The quarter never stayed anywhere for very long. It moved quietly from one life to another. One family used it to buy milk. Another child placed it inside a piggy bank. A college student carried it through an entire semester before spending it at a laundromat. A soldier slipped it into his duffel bag while traveling home to visit his parents. A grandfather handed it to his grandson after mowing the lawn. The boy smiled, ran to the nearest candy store, and spent it within minutes. The journey continued. Year after year, pocket after pocket, wallet after wallet, cash register after cash register. Nobody ever imagined that decades later, someone would stop, look closely, and wonder where that little quarter had been. Time never slowed down. The shiny surface slowly became softer. Tiny scratches appeared. The bright silver color changed. The sharp edges became smooth from years of honest circulation. Every mark told a story. Not a story written in books, but one written by ordinary people living ordinary lives. Then, nearly 60 years later, on a quiet Saturday afternoon, a young man was helping his grandmother clean her garage. Old furniture covered in dust, boxes stacked against the wall, shelves filled with forgotten memories. Near the back corner sat an old wooden cabinet that hadn't been opened in years. Inside, there were family photographs, birthday cards, old letters tied together with faded ribbon, a broken wristwatch, and one heavy glass jar. The grandmother smiled. "I haven't opened that jar in years." The young man lifted it carefully. It was filled with coins collected over decades, pennies, nickels, dimes, half-dollars, and dozens of Washington quarters. He carried the jar to the kitchen table, slowly unscrewed the lid. The coins poured onto the wooden surface with a sound unlike anything heard in years. The afternoon's sunlight coming through the window reflected across the pile. He began separating the quarters, one by one. Modern dates, older dates, nothing unusual. Then suddenly, his fingers stopped. He picked up one coin, turned it toward the light. The numbers became clear. 1967, for a brief moment. Everything around him disappeared. He wasn't thinking about money. He wasn't thinking about value. He was thinking about time. This tiny quarter had survived almost 6 decades. It had quietly traveled across America while generations grew older. It had witnessed changing fashions, changing technology, changing cities, changing families. Yet somehow, it was still here, resting quietly in the palm of his hand. His grandmother looked at the coin and smiled softly. "I remember when those were new." The young man looked up. "You do?" She nodded. I was younger than you are now. Those simple words changed everything. Suddenly. The quarter became more than metal. It became a bridge between generations. A silent reminder that history doesn't always live inside museums. Sometimes history fits into the palm of your hand. The young man carried the coin to the window. The evening sun reflected across Washington's portrait. The word liberty still stood proudly despite decades of use. The date, 1967. Looked back at him exactly as it had on the day it first left the mint. He whispered quietly, "I wonder where you've been." Of course, the quarter couldn't answer, but perhaps that mystery was far more valuable than knowing the truth, because every collector eventually learns the same lesson. The greatest part of coin collecting isn't finding an old coin. It's imagining the incredible journey hidden inside it. And somewhere tonight, another 1967 Washington quarter is quietly waiting inside a forgotten jar, a family coin box, a cash register, or maybe already resting inside someone's pocket, waiting for the next curious person to stop, turn it over, read the date, and begin another unforgettable story. The next morning, the young man couldn't stop thinking about the 1967 Washington quarter. It wasn't the oldest coin he had ever seen. It wasn't the brightest. It wasn't locked inside a museum. Yet somehow it felt different. He slipped it carefully into his wallet instead of spending it. Days passed. Every time he bought coffee every time he paid for gas every time a cashier handed him change. His eyes searched every quarter before putting it away. His friends noticed. "You actually check every coin," he smiled. "I never used to, but now double quotes, I wonder how many stories I've already spent without noticing." One Saturday afternoon, he decided to visit the oldest coin shop in town. The wooden door opened with a soft bell. The smell of old paper, polished wood, and leather filled the room. Glass display cases stretched from one side of the shop to the other. Silver dollars, Buffalo nickels, Lincoln cents, Morgan dollars, and rows upon rows of Washington quarters rested under bright lights. Behind the counter stood an elderly collector. His hands showed the signs of decades spent examining coins. He looked up and smiled. Looking for something special? The young man reached into his wallet and placed the 1967 Washington quarter on the glass counter. "I think this coin has a story." The old collector didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached for a small magnifying loupe. The room became silent. He carefully lifted the quarter by its edges, turned it beneath the lamp, studied every detail. Washington's portrait, the lettering, the rim, the tiny marks left by time. Nearly a full minute passed before he finally smiled. Then he placed the coin back onto the counter. "You know why I still love this hobby after all these years?" The young man shook his head. The collector leaned forward. "Because every coin is a mystery." He pointed toward the quarter. "Someone carried this to work." He gently turned it. "Someone probably bought groceries with it." Another slow turn. "Someone may have kept it inside a military jacket." He smiled again. "Someone might even have forgotten it inside a couch for 20 years. The young man laughed. "You really think about all that?" The old collector nodded. "Every single day. Most people only see money. Collectors see journeys." Those words stayed in the young man's mind. Before leaving, the collector handed him a small notebook. The cover was plain brown leather. "What is this for?" The old man smiled. "Write down where every interesting coin finds you. Not because you'll remember the coin but because you'll remember the moment, that evening . The young man opened the notebook. On the first page he wrote, 1967 Washington quarter found in Grandma's old glass jar. He looked at those words for several seconds, then closed the notebook. Weeks passed. His collection slowly began growing. Not because he was buying expensive coins, because he had learned to notice what everyone else ignored. Every trip to the grocery store became an adventure. Every visit to the bank felt like opening another chapter. Every handful of pocket change became another chance to discover a forgotten piece of history. One rainy afternoon. He stopped at a small diner outside the city. After finishing lunch. The waitress returned with his change. She smiled. "Have a wonderful day." He thanked her, walked toward the parking lot. Halfway to his car. He remembered the notebook. He opened his hand. 3 quarters rested in his palm. Without thinking, he checked the first. Modern date. The second. Another modern date. Then the third. He slowly turned it toward the light. For just a moment, His heart skipped. Another 1967, he couldn't believe it. 2 different quarters. 2 completely different journeys. One discovered in his grandmother's forgotten jar. Another received as change in a roadside diner miles away from home. He placed both quarters side by side that evening. Although they shared the same year, they looked nothing alike. One had darker surfaces. The other still reflected flashes of its original luster. One showed heavier wear. The other looked surprisingly well preserved. Same year, same design, completely different lives. That's when he finally understood what the old collector meant. Coins don't become interesting because they're identical. They become interesting because every single one tells a different story. And somewhere, at that exact moment, another 1967 Washington quarter was quietly moving through America, passing from one hand to another, waiting for the day someone would stop, turn it over, notice the date, and wonder where its remarkable journey had truly begun. Late that night, the house was completely silent. Rain tapped gently against the windows. The young collector placed both 1967 Washington quarters on his wooden desk. One came from his grandmother's old glass jar. The other had appeared unexpectedly in the change from a roadside diner. 2 identical years. 2 completely different journeys. He switched on a small desk lamp. The soft yellow light filled the room, slowly. He picked up the first quarter, turning it carefully between his fingers. Every tiny scratch reflected another chapter of its life. He imagined the people who had once carried it. Perhaps a young father rushing home after work. Perhaps a waitress saving tips for her first apartment. Perhaps a farmer stopping at a country store after a long day in the fields. Nobody could know. Yet every possibility felt real. He placed the first coin down, then lifted the second, immediately. Something felt different. The surface reflected light in another way. The details appeared slightly sharper. The lettering looked stronger. Not perfect, just different. He smiled. For the first time, he realized that no 2 coins are ever truly the same. Even when they shared the same year, even when they were struck in the same country, every journey leaves its own fingerprints. The next morning, he drove to the public library, not to borrow a novel, not to study for school. He wanted to learn more about the year. He searched through old newspapers preserved on microfilm. Page after page slowly rolled across the screen: headlines, advertisements, sports, local news, family photographs. The world looked completely different. Gas stations advertised fuel for just a few cents per gallon. Department stores announced weekend sales. Children smiled beside brand new bicycles in Christmas advertisements. Movie theaters displayed giant posters outside their entrances. Suddenly. Everything became connected. While those newspapers were being printed, while families were reading those headlines over breakfast. Somewhere, his little quarter was already traveling through America. Perhaps it rested inside someone's pocket while they read the morning news. Perhaps it sat inside a diner cash register while customers ordered coffee. Perhaps it was dropped into a jukebox that played the biggest songs of the year. History wasn't something happening far away. History was happening around that very coin. Hours passed inside the library. Before leaving, he carefully closed the final newspaper reel. As he walked toward the exit, an elderly librarian noticed the coin in his hand. She smiled kindly. "My father used to collect quarters." The young man stopped. "Really?" She nodded. "He always told me something I've never forgotten." She paused for a moment, then quietly said, "A coin isn't interesting because it's old. It's interesting because it survived everything that happened while it was alive." Those words stayed with him all the way home. That evening. He opened his notebook once again. Under the page marked 1967 Washington quarter, he wrote one sentence. "Every coin is a witness that can never speak." He closed the notebook, placed both quarters into protective holders, then looked out the window. The sun was setting. Cars continued driving through the streets. People hurried home from work. Stores prepared to close for the night. Cash registers counted thousands of coins. And somewhere, without anyone noticing, another 1967 Washington quarter quietly changed hands. A teenager received it after buying a sandwich. An elderly woman later used it to pay for a newspaper. Before midnight. It rested inside the pocket of someone who had no idea they were carrying a coin with nearly 60 years of history behind it. The young collector smiled. Because he finally understood something that every experienced collector eventually learns. The greatest discoveries aren't always found in expensive auctions or locked inside museum displays. Sometimes, the greatest discovery happens the moment an ordinary person stops, looks down at an ordinary quarter, reads the date, 1967, and realizes that history has been hiding in plain sight all along. The following weekend, the young collector woke before sunrise. For the first time in years, he wasn't excited about buying something new. He was excited about searching. He drove across town to one of the oldest flea markets in the state. Hundreds of vendors were already setting up their tables. The smell of fresh coffee filled the cool morning air. Collectors, families, tourists, walked slowly through endless rows of antiques, old cameras, vintage watches, military medals, handwritten letters, pocket knives, typewriters, baseball cards, and boxes filled with forgotten treasures. Most people walked past them without stopping. The young collector kept walking until something caught his eye. A handwritten cardboard sign rested against a wooden table. Old U.S. coins, choose any. He stopped immediately. An elderly woman sat quietly behind the table reading a newspaper. She smiled. Take your time, he nodded politely. In front of him, several small wooden trays held hundreds of American coins. Some were bright, some were dark with age. Some had obviously spent decades in circulation. He picked up one quarter after another. 1907 for ... 1988 ... 1991 ... 1983 ... 1978 ... Nothing unusual. Minutes passed. People came and went. Some bought old books. Others collected glass bottles. Nobody paid attention to the young man sitting quietly beside the coin trays. Then, one quarter reflected the morning sunlight differently. He picked it up, turned it over. His breathing slowed. The date appeared. 1967, another one. He couldn't believe it. 3 different quarters. The same year. 3 completely different lives. The elderly woman noticed his smile. You found something interesting. He held up the coin. I think I did. She looked at it for only a moment before smiling. My husband collected quarters for nearly 40 years. She gently folded her newspaper. He always told me that every coin carries the values. The young man looked curious. The values. She nodded. The first is what you can spend. She pointed toward the quarter. The second is the story you'll never be able to replace. The young collector stood quietly. Those words stayed in his mind. He paid for the coin, placed it carefully into a small holder, then continued walking through the market. Hours later, he reached a booth selling old leather wallets. Inside, one worn brown wallet. The seller had forgotten several coins. The seller laughed. I guess those belong to whoever buys the wallet. The young collector smiled. He opened the wallet. Inside, 3 modern quarters, 1 dime, 2 pennies. Nothing extraordinary. Yet he checked every date anyway, because now, checking had become a habit. Not an obligation, a habit. Every collector eventually develops it. The habit of looking twice. The habit of asking questions. The habit of wondering where every coin has been. On his drive home, he stopped for fuel. The cashier handed him his change. Without thinking, he checked again. Another modern quarter. Nothing special. Yet he still smiled. Because the excitement wasn't about finding something rare every single time. The excitement came from knowing the next discovery could happen anywhere. At a grocery store, at a gas station, at a bank, inside an old family jar, or even beneath the cushions of an old sofa. That evening, he placed all 3 1967 Washington quarters side by side. One from his grandmother's jar, one from the roadside diner, one from the flea market. Each looked completely different. One carried heavy scratches. Another still reflected soft mint luster. The third had dark gray toning earned through decades of circulation. 3 coins, 1 year. 3 completely different journeys. He opened his notebook. Below each coin, he carefully wrote where it had been found. Not because anyone else would read those pages, but because one day, years from now, someone might inherit the notebook. Someone might hold those same quarters. Someone might continue adding new chapters to stories that began long before they were born. Outside, the night grew quiet. Streetlights reflected across the rain-soaked road. Somewhere in the distance, a convenience store cashier counted the day's earnings. Among hundreds of ordinary coins, Another 1967 Washington quarter quietly slipped into the cash drawer. Its journey wasn't over. In fact, perhaps the most unforgettable chapter of its story hadn't even begun yet. Some stories never truly end. They simply find a new person to carry them forward. Months passed. The young collector's shelf slowly filled with coin holders. Each one represented a different discovery, a different place, a different memory, yet every time he opened the collection, his eyes always stopped on the three 1967 Washington quarters, not because they looked the best, not because they were the oldest, but because they reminded him how everything had started. One ordinary afternoon, a local elementary school invited collectors to display their collections during a history event. The young collector almost said no. He wasn't famous, he wasn't an expert. He didn't own priceless treasures, but something told him to go. The school gymnasium filled with students, tables displayed old photographs, military uniforms, vintage radios, historic newspapers, and family heirlooms. Near the corner of the room, the young collector carefully arranged his coins. People walked past, some smiled politely, others barely looked. Then a little boy stopped. He couldn't have been older than 10. His eyes immediately focused on the 3 quarters. He pointed toward one. "Why do you keep these?" The young collector smiled. Instead of answering immediately, he placed the 1967 Washington quarter into the boy's hand. "Tell me what you see." The boy looked closely. "A quarter." The collector nodded. "What else?" The boy turned it over. "It's old." The collector smiled again. "What else?" The boy stayed quiet. After several seconds, he whispered, "I don't know." The young collector gently replied, "Neither do I." The boy looked confused. The collector continued, "I don't know who spent it first. I don't know how many cities it visited. I don't know how many people carried it. I don't know how many stories it has witnessed, but that's exactly why I love it." The little boy stared at the coin again. This time, he wasn't looking at money. He was looking at history. For the first time, he understood coins aren't only made of metal, they're made of memories. By the end of the event, dozens of children had visited the table. Some asked questions, some shared stories about old coins their grandparents kept. Others promised to start checking their own pocket change. As everyone packed up to leave, the school principal walked over. She smiled and quietly said, "You didn't just show children some old coins today, you taught them how to notice history." Those words stayed with the young collector for a long time. That evening, he returned home, placed the 3 1967 Washington quarters back into their holders, opened the notebook. Then wrote one final sentence beneath the last page. "Every great collection begins with curiosity, not money." He slowly closed the cover, turned off the desk lamp, and looked out the window. Cars continued driving through the quiet streets. Stores prepared to close. Cashiers counted change, families emptied their pockets onto kitchen tables. Children dropped loose coins into piggy banks. Across America, thousands of Washington quarters quietly changed hands once again. Most would never be noticed, most would be spent tomorrow, but somewhere someone would pause, someone would turn over a quarter, someone would read the date 1967 and at that exact moment, another journey would begin. Maybe that person would become a collector. Maybe they would pass the coin to their children. Maybe they would place it inside a small box that would remain unopened for decades. Nobody knows, because the greatest part of every coin story is the chapter that hasn't been written yet. Thank you for joining us on Hidden Coin Digest. If you enjoy discovering the hidden stories behind American coins, Washington quarters, and the remarkable journeys hidden inside everyday pocket change, subscribe and join thousands of collectors who believe every coin deserves a second look. Until our next adventure, keep checking your pocket change, keep asking questions, keep discovering history, because the next ordinary quarter you receive could become the beginning of an extraordinary story.